She thought her wedding would be the happiest day of her life, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. As she walked down the aisle, heart with excitement, she had no idea that the man waiting for her had been keeping a secret. A secret that would leave the entire crowd in tears and change her life forever. Because when he'd everyone gasped, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever witnessed a wedding moment that left you speechless? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Before we continue, let us know, where are you watching from? Before we continue, let us know, where are you watching from? Emma always believed in fairy tales, but she never expected hers to look like this. She was the kind of woman with a heart too big for her own good, kind, thoughtful, and the type who'd pick wildflowers over roses any day. She grew up in a small town where people thought love was supposed to follow a script. Meet someone like you, live a simple life, stay inside the lines. But Emma never cared about lines. Then came James. James wasn't the kind of man people expected Emma to fall for. He was bold, brilliant, and carried a quiet strength that didn't need words to be felt. His deep laugh could light up a room, but his wheelchair often made people look at him differently, like that was the first thing they noticed. But not Emma. When she saw him, she didn't see the chair. She saw the man, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the depth in his voice when he talked about his dreams, and the warmth he carried even on his worst days. Their love wasn't simple. People whispered. Some even questioned Emma's choices. "Are you sure this is what you want?" they'd ask. But Emma never flinched. She knew what she wanted. And it was James. The wedding day arrived, set in a beautiful garden with white chairs lined up neatly, soft music in the breeze, and sunlight slipping through tall oak trees. But beneath all the beauty, there was something unspoken, a tension Emma couldn't shake. James seemed different that morning, more anxious than usual, like he was carrying a secret he wasn't ready to share. And that's where everything began. The morning of the wedding was picture perfect, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. James was usually the calm one between them, but today he seemed distracted. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and there was a tension in his jaw she'd never seen before. "Are you okay?" Emma had whispered the night before, her hand gently resting on his. James nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Just nervous," he replied with a forced smile. But Emma knew him better than that. As the hours ticked by, little things started piling up. James's best man, Darren, kept checking his watch, and quick glances with James when they thought no one was looking. There was an envelope tucked into James's suit jacket. Emma saw it briefly when he adjusted his collar, and part of the wedding plans. She wanted to ask, but something stopped her. Maybe she didn't want to ruin the moment. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. The guests arrived one by one, filling the garden with soft murmurs and polite laughter. Emma noticed the looks some people gave her, subtle but not invisible. A few guests whispered, their eyes darting from James in his wheelchair to Emma in her flowing white dress. She'd heard it all before. She could have married anyone. Why him? But she never let it bother her. She knew their love was real, deeper than what anyone could see on the surface. Still, today, those looks felt heavier. As the ceremony began, Emma stood at the edge of the aisle, her heart pounding, not just from excitement, but from something she couldn't name. Her father gave her hand a reassuring before walking her down the aisle. She tried to focus on James, sitting at the altar, his eyes locked on hers. But even from a distance, she could see the tension in his face, the slight tremble in his hands. When she reached him, he squeezed her hand tightly, holding on like he was anchoring himself. The officiant began speaking, but Emma barely heard the words. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't ask, not here, not now. Then came the vows. James's voice was steady at first, filled with the warmth and love she knew so well. But as he continued, his voice started to shake. His hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair tightly, his knuckles turning white. Emma felt her chest tighten. And then he paused. A long, heavy pause. Everyone shifted in seats, glancing at each other. The silence grew louder with each passing second. James took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He placed his hands on the wheels of his chair. Emma watched, her breath in her throat, as he pushed himself forward slightly, and then did something no one expected. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair and started to stand. At first, it was just a slight movement, like he was trying and failing. But then, with every ounce of strength in his body, he pushed himself up. His legs trembled, his face contorted with effort, but he was standing. The crowd gasped. Some people covered their mouths, others stood in disbelief. Emma couldn't move. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the image of the man she loved standing in front of her, defying everything she thought she knew. James's voice broke the silence. "I've been working on this for months," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to stand next to you on our wedding day, to show you that you've given me the strength to believe in things I thought were impossible." Emma's tears spilled over, streaming down her face as she stepped closer, holding his hands to steady him. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered through her sobs. James smiled, though his legs wobbled. "I wanted to, because you stood by me when no one else did. I wanted to stand for you." The crowd erupted in applause, tears flowing freely among the guests who had doubted, whispered, judged. In that moment, none of it mattered. Emma leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "You've always stood for me," she whispered, "even when you were sitting." They exchanged vows through tears, their voices trembling but strong, and when it was time to kiss, James stayed standing, holding Emma close, their hearts beating as one. But the surprises weren't over yet. The reception was in full swing, but Emma's heart was still racing from what had just happened at the ceremony. She replayed it over and over in her head. James standing, defying all odds. It wasn't just about him getting up from that chair. It was everything that moment represented. Strength, love, determination. But there was something else. Something that lingered in the way James occasionally winced when no one was looking. The way he leaned a little heavier on his best man when he thought Emma wasn't paying attention. And that envelope, still tucked into his jacket pocket. Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. She found him standing near the edge of the dance floor, pretending to be completely at ease, but she saw right through it. "What's going on, James?" she asked quietly, her hand resting on his arm. James gave her a soft smile, but his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing, just enjoying the moment." Emma shook her head. "Don't lie to me, not today." James sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the envelope she'd noticed earlier. He held it out to her, his hands trembling, not from weakness, but from fear. Emma hesitated, then took it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in James's neat script. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. The letter wasn't just a love note or a heartfelt message. It was a confession. James had been keeping a secret, not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want to burden her. Months ago, His doctor had given him a diagnosis that changed everything. His condition was more complicated than he'd let on. The progress he'd made to stand at their wedding had come with a cost, one he hadn't wanted her to know. The strain on his body was more severe than he admitted, and the chances of him walking again without significant risk were slim. But he did it anyway. For her. Emma's hands shook as she finished reading. She looked up, tears filling her eyes, but this time they weren't just tears of joy. They were mixed with fear, anger, and overwhelming love. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James looked down, his jaw tight. "Because I didn't want you to worry. I wanted our wedding day to be perfect. I wanted you to remember me standing, not struggling." Emma took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "But we're supposed to face things together. That's what marriage is." James's eyes glistened. "I know, but I wanted to give you this moment, just once, without pity, without fear." Emma didn't know whether to cry harder or hold him tighter. So she did both. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "You're an idiot," she whispered against his shirt, her voice muffled by tears. James chuckled softly, resting his chin on her head. "Yeah, but I'm your idiot." They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the world around them faded away. When they finally pulled apart, Emma cupped his face in her hands. "You don't have to be perfect for me. I married you because of who you are, not because you can stand or walk. You've always been my strength, with or without this." James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Later that evening, as the music played and guests danced, James surprised Emma one more time. Despite the strain, he insisted on having their first dance standing. With every shaky step, every falter, Emma was right there, holding him, supporting him, not just physically, but emotionally. They danced slowly, surrounded by friends and family who had doubted, judged, and whispered. But none of that mattered now, because in that moment, it was just Emma and James, two souls intertwined, standing tall in the face of everything life had thrown at them. And that's when Emma realized the truth. James didn't stand for her. He stood with her, and that made all the difference. The wedding had been full of surprises. James standing at the altar, the emotional confession about his health, and their heartfelt first dance. But Emma had no idea that James had one more surprise waiting, and this one would leave her and everyone else completely speechless. As the night wore on, the guests began to settle down. The laughter softened and the music faded into a gentle background hum. James tapped a spoon against his glass, drawing everyone's attention. His voice, though soft, carried across the room. "There's one more thing," he began, glancing at Emma with a mischievous smile. "I've kept a lot of secrets leading up to today, but this one is different." Emma's heart raced. After everything, what more could there be? James motioned to his best man, Darren, who nodded and disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. The room grew quiet, the curiosity thick in the air. James opened the box and pulled out an envelope, one that looked old, with faded edges and handwriting that wasn't his. "This," James said, holding it up, "was written long before I ever met Emma. It's from my late mother." Emma's breath caught. James rarely talked about his mother. She had passed away when he was young, and it was a part of his life he kept tucked away, guarded like a fragile piece of his heart. James continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. "My mom was everything to me. She used to say, 'Love isn't just about finding the right person. It's about becoming the right person for someone else.' Before she passed, she wrote me this letter. She told me to open it when I found the one." He glanced at Emma, his gaze filled with warmth. "I never thought I'd open it." The room was silent as James carefully unfolded the letter. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Dear James, if you're reading this, it means you've found her, the person who makes your heart feel like home. I know you've faced challenges, and I wish I could be there to see the man you've become. But life isn't always about what we lose. It's about what we find, even in the hardest moments. When you find her, don't let fear hold you back. Love her with everything you have. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard." James's voice cracked as he paused, wiping a tear from his cheek. Emma felt her own tears fall freely, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't put into words. He continued, his voice softer now. "And to the woman reading this, thank you. Thank you for seeing my son for who he truly is, not for what the world might see, but for the heart he carries. He's stronger than he knows, and if he loves you, it's because you've touched a part of his soul no one else could reach. Take care of him, and let him take care of you too." James folded the letter, his eyes glistening with tears. The room was silent, the weight of his mother's words settling over everyone like a blanket of warmth and sadness. Emma stood, her heart bursting. She walked over to James, her hands gently cupping his face. "She would be so proud of you," she whispered. James's tears fell freely now, but his smile was radiant. "She'd love you." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They hugged, their hearts beating in sync. The letter pressed between them like a bridge connecting the past and the present. But James wasn't done. He reached into the box again, pulling out a small velvet pouch. "I had this made," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate necklace. The pendant was simple, a small heart intertwined with an anchor. She used to say love is like an anchor. It holds you steady when life gets rough. "You're my anchor, Emma." Emma sobbed, her hands trembling as he fastened the necklace around her neck. The crowd erupted in applause, tears streaming down faces everywhere. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. And that's when Emma realized this wasn't just a wedding. It was a testament to love's ability to endure, to heal, and to surprise us in the most beautiful ways. The days following the wedding felt like a dream Emma never wanted to wake up from. Not because of the beautiful ceremony, the fancy decorations, or the joyful celebration, but because of the journey that led to that moment. A journey filled with love, fear, courage, and most of all, growth. Emma and James returned to their small apartment, surrounded by wedding gifts, cards filled with heartfelt messages, and the lingering warmth of memories made. But it wasn't the gifts or the photos that stayed with Emma. It was James's mother's letter. She kept it on their bedside table, reading it quietly some nights, feeling like she was getting to know a woman she never met but who felt like family. James, too, was different. There was a lightness in him, a freedom that came from no longer hiding his struggles. His health remained fragile, but his spirit had never been stronger. He started physical therapy again, not to prove anything, but because he wanted to keep fighting for himself and for Emma. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across their living room, Emma found James staring out the window. His wheelchair was beside him, but he was standing, leaning slightly on the edge of the table for support. She walked over quietly, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" James smiled, his hand covering hers. "How lucky I am." Emma rested her chin on his shoulder. "Lucky? After everything?" James turned to face her, his eyes soft and full of warmth. Yeah, lucky that I found someone who didn't just accept me, but saw me, even when I didn't see myself. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about all the moments that had led them here, the judgment from strangers, the whispers, the doubts even she had battled quietly. But none of that mattered now. "You saved me," he whispered. Emma shook her head gently. "Number, you saved yourself. I just stood beside you." And that was the truth. Love isn't about rescuing someone. It's about standing beside them when they face the storms of life. It's about being their anchor when the waves get rough, but also letting them fight their own battles, knowing you'll be there no matter what. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a beautiful rhythm. James continued his therapy, celebrating small victories, standing a little longer, walking a few more steps. Not for anyone else's approval, but because he wanted it for himself. Emma pursued her passion for writing, inspired by their story. She wrote about love, resilience, and the lessons life had taught her. About how the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall, but the ones who keep getting back up. One day, she received an email from a small publishing company. They wanted to publish her story. She rushed home, bursting through the door with excitement. James was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album. She dropped the letter in front of him, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "They want to publish it," she whispered, her voice shaking. James read the letter, then looked up at her with a proud smile. "Of course they do. It's a story the world needs to hear." And he was right. Their story wasn't just about overcoming physical challenges. It was about breaking barriers of prejudice, of fear, of self-doubt. It was about love in its purest form. On the day the book was published, Emma held the first copy in her hands, her name printed boldly on the cover. But when she opened it, the dedication page read, "To James, who taught me that love isn't about standing tall. It's about standing together." James laughed when he saw it, pulling her into his arms. "You know," he whispered, "you're my favorite author." Emma smiled, her heart full. "And you're my favorite story." Years passed, but their love remained the same, rooted in respect, honesty, and the lessons they'd learned along the way. They faced more challenges, more hard days, but they faced them together. And every time Emma felt lost, she'd read that letter from James's mother, the words etched into her heart. Love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Because in the end, that's all love really is, choosing each other every single day. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't about fairy tale endings or perfect moments. They're about the real, raw, and unexpected turns life takes, the ones that teach us who we really are. Emma and James's story wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and filled with challenges. But that's what made it beautiful, because love isn't about standing tall. It's about standing together. It's about showing up even when it's hard, loving someone not despite their flaws, but because of them. It's about holding someone's hand when they're too tired to keep walking and letting them lean on you when life gets heavy. Emma and James taught us that love isn't found in grand gestures or perfect moments. It's found in the quiet, everyday choices to keep choosing each other. Now, let me ask you, have you ever experienced a moment that redefined what love means to you? Maybe it was an unexpected gesture, a small act of kindness, or a time when someone stood by you when you needed it most. I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that real love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest impact.